G'day to all of our viewers around Australia and the rest of the world. This webinar is special. It's not every day that you get to discuss and debate the big ideas with the kind of special guests that we have with us today. Professor Noam Chomsky has been described as the greatest living intellectual of our time. Having published over 100 books, his name has featured in more footnotes and bibliographies than anyone else's across the fields of linguistics, cognitive science, politics, history, philosophy, computer science, sociology, and anthropology, among many others. For decades, he has been well known as a voice of dissent in global academia, particularly when it comes to United States foreign policy. Perhaps the fact that a dissenting voice like his can have a platform at America's top Ivy League universities for more than half a century and remain the world's most celebrated academic is credit to America's vibrant liberal democracy itself, something he might like to debate us on. We gather today to talk about a range of fascinating topics to do with the past and the present. I'll be focusing mostly on world politics, and my friend, colleague, and the other special guest, Israeli linguist and revivalist professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann, will be leading the discussion on linguistics. Viewers around the world are welcome to submit their questions in the comments, and I will read them out where practical to do so. This is going to be a fascinating chat, and I want you to sit back and enjoy it. So to get the ball rolling, Professor, my first question is, America may not be perfect, but it's done plenty of good things. Abolition of slavery, enfranchisement of women, the repeal of discriminatory laws. I understand you're very critical of your country, but do you accept that overall, America has done more good than harm to its own people and to the rest of the world?
It's a mixture. Let's take abolition. First of all, there are other people who used to live in this country, Indian nations. They were exterminated. Is that virtually exterminated? One of the reasons for the American Revolution was that the British had established a boundary, Appalachian Mountains, saying settlers can't go west of that boundary into what was called Indian country, where the Indian nations were, many nations. The settlers didn't want that. They wanted to move west. One of the main reasons for the revolution was to break this limit. And as soon as the colonists won their freedom, they immediately invaded Indian country. The United States is one of those rare countries that's been at war virtually every year since its founding. It's not presented that way, but it's a fact. Through the 19th century, the United States conquered the Indian nations, drove them out, exterminated them. This is not unfamiliar in Australia, of course. The British colonies did it everywhere. The conquered half of Mexico onward with other interventions. Well, they're still scattered in reservations, living under terrible conditions, but one can hardly say that they were well treated. There's another category of people, slaves. Now, they were brought to the United States 400 years ago, the first ones. After the colonies were established, they instituted the most vicious, horrendous system of slavery that has ever existed. Slavery existed in one or another form back to antiquity, but this was something totally new. Furthermore, it created the basis for the prosperity and growth of the country. Cotton was the fuel of the 19th century. It was the basis for the first industrial revolution, for textile manufacturers, for finance, for commerce, retail. And in fact, on the basis of this hideous system of slavery, the United States and also Britain, and to a certain extent the other European countries, gained the basis for their wealth and prosperity. France, for example, about probably 20% of its wealth came from a hideous colony in Haiti, slavery. So what happened? You mentioned abolition. Well, technically, abolition took place in 1865, technically. what actually happened was there were 10 years in which the South was occupied by Northern troops. Blacks had an opportunity. They entered into politics. They began to enter into businesses, farming and so on. They did extremely well. 1877, an agreement was signed between the North and the South. The North withdrew the troops. South was permitted to do whatever it liked, reinstituted slavery. In fact, one of the main books on it is called Slavery by Another Name. What the South did was essentially criminalize black life. So if a black man was standing on a street corner, he could be arrested for vagrancy, given a fine that he couldn't pay, went to jail, spent the rest of his life there, or maybe in a chain gang, providing a wonderful workforce for the Second Industrial Revolution, the late 19th century, early 20th century. Perfect workforce, no unions, no protests. Employer didn't have to pay any wages, just wonderful. That lasted almost until the Second World War. Then there were a couple of years of relative freedom, and it started again. So until the 1960s, for example, late 1960s, federal law required that federally funded housing couldn't have African Americans, pure white. That's the way you create wealth in the United States. So they couldn't create a basis for wealth. Then comes one thing after another, leading to the terrible, grim legacy, which is being protested on the streets of the United States right now, seriously for the first time. That's significant. It's the growth of consciousness of how a large part of the population was treated miserably throughout our history. So yes, for some, the government did very good things. For me, for example, my father came from a medieval level village in the Ukraine, full of mud, virtually illiterate and so on. Came to the United States, worked in a rag factory, was able to make it to college, was able to have children who were professionals. So for the immigrants, yes. And that has its problems as well. So my father happened to be able to come in before the racist immigration law of 1924, which there had been laws banning Asians, Chinese, they allowed Japanese in, but banning Chinese. 1924, there was a law, first one banning Europeans. It was aimed at Italians and Jews. They couldn't come in under the immigration law. That sent millions of Jews to crematoria, including my whole extended family. They were stuck in Europe. They couldn't come here, nowhere else to go. Nazis came, Ukrainian fascists came, finished. That lasted until the mid-1960s. So yes, there's a lot of successes which came from pretty much what's going on in the streets today, from activist movements which pressed the limits, broke through, created new freedoms, many ways created a country with many positive characteristics and plenty of flaws. I don't know any other country where you can say anything different. Certainly not Australia.
So no, that look, there's a lot that you've said that I guess many other academics probably would want to see differently. They probably would want to challenge you on that when we're pressed for time and we've got a lot of questions to get through. So perhaps if we can keep our responses a bit succinct, we can get through more questions that way. The only follow-up, I guess, from your response is that my question was more geared towards, are we accepting the premise that the United States has overall done more good than bad? Now, this is ultimately a value judgment, and I know that it could be argued either way. But the sort of changes that, Noam, if I can just finish the question, the sort of changes that the United States has been able to go through there's plenty of societies around the world that would have struggled to even facilitate the voices of dissent, like yourself, or the suffragist movement or the anti-slavery movement, a lot of societies wouldn't have even been able to facilitate that level of dissent. Would you agree with that premise?
Look, you can't really answer. There's a history with some triumphs and successes, many crimes, serious crimes. You can say that anywhere. If you ask, how do the two measure? It depends who you ask. Ask Afro-Americans, it's been a horror story. Ask the remnants of Native Americans, total horror story. Ask people in Central America, where the United States repeatedly invaded, overthrew governments, instituted brutal, vicious dictatorships. It's been a horror story. It depends who you look at. For me and my parents, it was a success.
Right, right. Okay. Look, we're going to move on to my next question now, Professor. So you've often referred to United States foreign policy as a form of imperialism. Even if this is true, would you agree that American imperialism defeats its alternatives, or would you rather live under a Russia or China-led world order?
Well, there's no comparable Russian or Chinese imperialism. There was in Eastern Europe, but in fact, let's take a careful look. Eastern Europe was under Russian rule during the Cold War period. It was pretty awful. Latin America was under US rule during the same years. Take a look at straight academic scholarship, not my opinion. The Cambridge History of the Cold War, main academic scholarly study of the Cold War. There's a chapter on Latin America by a distinguished scholar, John Coatsworth, a professor at Columbia. And he points out that in the post-Stalin period, if you take a look at torture, violence, repression, vicious violence, it was considerably worse in the US domains in Latin America than it was in Russia's Eastern European domains. So again, depends who you ask.
Well, I guess the question that it comes down to, Noam, is that at the end of World War II, the United States had the sort of military capacity to literally carry on and conquer the rest of the world if it wanted to. But instead, wouldn't you agree that it actually went the other direction, and it went through some of the greatest, I guess, denuclearization program to reduce its military capacity? It also, pumped billions of dollars into countries like Japan, for example, to help them have a pathway to recovery. I mean, this is hardly the behavior of an aggressive imperialist. Would you agree with that proposition?
No, I would not. It has nothing to do with what happened. Japanese recovery took place primarily because of the Vietnam War at first, the Korean War, and later the Vietnam War. Japan was kind of a backup for the US war in Korea. Later it was sort of a backup for the US war in Vietnam. Out of that came the foundations of Japanese prosperity. The United States didn't pour billions of dollars in fact, nothing. What actually happened was that after the Second World War, Japan was under US military rule. General Douglas MacArthur was basically proconsul. He more or less let the Japanese do whatever they wanted. Now, what they did was move towards developing a democratic system. The unions developed collective ownership of means of production. They began to undermine the old zaibatsu system, the feudal, brutal system of the pre-war Japan. When the liberals in Washington got wind of this, they were horrified. And they started what was called the reverse course, 1947, try to reconstruct pretty much the old semi-feudalistic Japan. Now that's basically what happened, because they didn't want any of this radical stuff taking place, like working people taking over factories, unions developing, and so on. And out of that developed, you know, through a mixture of Japanese initiative and US control and the hideous US wars in Asia, Japan developed. In the case of Europe, there was absolutely no chance of the United States conquering Europe. Remember that the Russians had defeated Nazi Germany. About 80% of the German troops till the end were on the Eastern Front. The Russians had an overwhelming land force. Actually, Winston Churchill did toy with the idea of maintaining German industry so that based on Germany, the West could then invade and attack Russia. That was called Operation Unthinkable. One of Churchill's ideas. He had to put it aside. It was completely unfeasible. So what happened is Europe was divided. Okay, Russia ran one part of it. The U.S., secondarily England, ran the other part, and they reconstructed it in ways for their own interests. So the United States, after the Second World War, was the only surviving manufacturing country. Even before the war, it had been by far the richest economic power. And now it had a huge manufacturing surplus. There was a problem that was called the dollar gap. There was nobody to buy European, US manufacturing. The economy was going to collapse, had to overcome the dollar gap. How was that done? A pretty sophisticated mechanism. The old European colonies, like Malaysia, were handed back to their former imperial masters. The United States tried it with France, but couldn't manage. And they were able to exploit their colonies to extract raw materials, which they could then sell, get the dollars, so they could buy American manufacturers. Europe was reconstructed as a society that would be basically dominated by the United States. The US, for example, shifted European energy from coal-based to oil-based because the US essentially controlled the oil system. And therefore it could have what George Kennan, the leading planner, called veto power over its allies by holding on to the spigot. Multinationals were just developing at the time, mostly American, and they were able to expand and have a European market they could expand into. So Europe did develop, reconstructed as part of the global system designed to ensure the welfare of the central institutions of American society, growing multinational and corporate institutions. So it's a mixture. It's, you take a look at, say, Africa. What happened to Africa? That's interesting. If you look at the post-war.
So, sorry. If I can just pause you for a moment before we get on to Africa, I guess the premise of my question is the manner in which power manifests itself on any level is that you're going to end up creating some sort of a pyramid. It's like a cricket team has a captain, or I guess to put it in your terms familiar to you, a baseball team needs a captain. I guess if we apply that simple analogy to the world, there's always been a captain, whether it was the ancient Greeks, whether it was the Romans, whether it was the Abbasid Caliphate during the medieval era. So the way I interpret the United States' role in the present world is that it just happens to be the captain. Now, I look at it, I'm not saying that the captain is perfect. I'm not saying that the captain always gets it right, but does that captain beat the alternatives? The alternative is that if the United States wasn't in this position, would it be Russia? Would it be China? Would it be India? What, who else fills that vacuum? Unless if you're trying to say that we can have a team without a captain, that we can have a multi-civilizational world where nobody has to sort of be at the top of the pyramid. Is that even feasible?
Yeah, you could have a global society in which people are free to run their own affairs and aren't under the control of a dominant hegemon which smashes them in the face if they don't do the right thing. Could have such a world. So let's take concrete cases. Vietnam, for example, after it overthrew French imperialism, which was strongly supported by the United States. The United States provided 80% of the arms to France. Okay, Vietnam could have gone on its own course. Where it would have gone, we don't know. Wouldn't have been conquered by Russia. It could have gone on its own course. Instead, the United States intervened, practically destroyed the country, killed a couple of million people, poisoned the land, devastated the place, the worst crime since the Second World War. Well, it didn't have to happen. Take another country not far from you, Indonesia.
Yeah.
In Indonesia, in 1965, the United States, actually in 1958, major U.S. intervention in Indonesia to try to prevent Indonesia, to block the moves towards Indonesian democracy, try to strip away the outer islands where the resources were and take control of them. That didn't work. But in 1965, finally, it worked. There was a military coup, killed a couple 100,000, maybe several million people, devastated the independent political parties, instituted a regime of torture and brutality. The United States was euphoric. And so was Australia, incidentally. You read the press at the time, the liberal press, say the New York Times, they described what was happening. They said it's a staggering bloodbath, mass slaughter, and it was called A Gleam of Light in Asia. Finally, there's some hope in Asia. The New York Times editorials, same in Australia, incidentally, praised the U.S. government for keeping its own role quiet. So the Indonesian moderates, the generals who are carrying out the staggering slaughter, would be able to claim credit for it themselves. In fact, in retrospect, McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, in retrospect, he said, we should have called off the Vietnam War right there, because the main worry in the Vietnam War was that an independent Vietnam might spread the disease of independent development to the rest of Asia, which would be a danger. And now that Indonesia was safely under the control of one of the most brutal and vicious dictators on the world, everything was fine. So yes, that's another way of doing good. Okay.
Right.
It's best not to listen to the speeches on 4th of July Day and to actually look at the facts of what happened. Not just the United States, Australia, England. If I had time to talk about Africa, I'd bring in England. France, right to this day, is carrying out vicious atrocities in West Africa. It's a lot of nice things, a lot of hideous things.
Okay, well, I want to turn our focus now to a topic that is very dear to my heart, as it is to yours, and we've both written and spoken extensively about the dispute over the country that our friend Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann comes from. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is obviously at the forefront of all territorial debates. It's been described as the most intractable conflict in human history, and that's probably not an exaggeration. Would you agree, Professor, with the premise that whilst plenty of wrong has been done from multiple sides involved in this conflict, overall, Israel has done more to extend an olive branch to the Palestinians, and sadly, that opportunity has been missed by the Palestinian leadership. Would you agree with that premise?
No, that is the far-right Israeli propaganda, which is exactly the opposite of what happened. You want to go through it? 1976, there was a United Nations Security Council resolution supported by the major Arab states, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, and I'm now quoting, with guarantees for the right of the two states in the former Palestine, of Israel and Palestine, guarantee for their rights to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. Israel reacted violently. Prime Minister Rabin said, "We will never permit a Palestinian state. We will never negotiate with Palestinians." The president, later President Chaim Herzog, another liberal who was then UN ambassador, said falsely, he said, "This was prepared by the PLO in order to destroy us. We can't have anything to do with it." Totally false. The US vetoed it. That's the way it continued to this day. Take a look at the most recent UN Security Council resolution on this, 2334, a couple of years ago, supported by the entire world, except the United States and Israel. It says that it calls for almost exactly what the 76 resolution did. Two-state settlement on the international border, illegitimacy of taking land by force. For once, the US didn't veto it. It just didn't vote. It just abstained, so it doesn't exist. Israel, of course, doesn't pay any attention, attacked it strongly. It's what you described, which is the right-wing propaganda, hasbara, as they call it in Hebrew. It's exactly the opposite of the truth. If you went through the further details, I could go through it all the way. So
no, of course you can. You've written extensively, and I've read. I appreciate quite a lot of your arguments, but I guess what the question I'm asking is, see, your response started much later than I was imagining in my mind. I was sort of imagining the Peel Commission report 1937, right? The Peel Commission report recommended a partition of the land, which the Jewish leadership, the Zionist leadership, was more willing to accept than the Arab High Committee at the other end. Then I'm talking here about the UN Partition Plan 181 in 1947. Had any of these deals been accepted, there would have been two states side by side, much like Australia and New Zealand, or Canada and the United States, and they would have been able to, both people would have been able to maintain their demographic majority on their separate turf. Is that something that you're disagreeing with?
Well, let's take a look at it again. The partition resolution gave the Jewish population, which 55% of the former Palestine, Jews at the time owned 7% of the land. So the group that owned 7% of the land was given 55% of the territory. Ben Gurion, the head of the Jewish agency, then the state, you take a look at his diaries. He said, "Okay, we'll take this because we can get it, but then we're going to expand further. Okay, we're going to keep going." Suppose that somebody came to Australia, let's say immigrants from China, and they started coming into Australia, and finally they owned 7% of the land. And then they said, "Why don't you give us 55% of Australia?" Would Australians say, "Oh, that's a nice idea, we'll accept that"? I don't think so. So when you look at the facts again, it looks a little bit differently. You can't just keep the propaganda.
Look, I can see our friend Ghil'ad Zuckermann having a bit of a chuckle. I know he's a linguist, and this is probably not exactly his field, but I probably do want to draw him into this discussion in a moment. But before we do that, I just want to make a quick comment. Look, there is no denying that the demography of the territory we're discussing has altered several times throughout history. If we look back, I guess you could say there was a proto-Jewish state. This is if you accept the narrative of, Kings David and Solomon, and you look at the Assyrian invasion, the Babylonian invasion, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on and so forth. And even beyond that. So, we're not denying, we were talking off the air before we went live about Hebrew. Hebrew is not a made-up language, it's a revived language. In its ancient form, it was once a living spoken language on that land. So I guess if we accept the premise that that land is where Judaism comes from. It's where Jewish civilization begins. It's where they had a booming, thriving, living Hebrew-speaking culture, which suffered dispossession and displacement. Then it changes the conversation and how we look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? It's a case of the indigenous people, if we may use that term, returning to the land that they held in the ancient times. Is that a premise that you accept?
Well, let's take the case of Australia again. Suppose there happened to be a group in China that says, we used to live in Australia, used to be our country 2,500 years ago, and we spoke Chinese there. And then we were expelled and we've been somewhere else for 2,500 years, 2,000 years. Now we want to come back and take it, so give it to us. How would you like that?
Look, at the end of the day, this is I am the first to accept that the Israeli case is so unique that I don't think that you can compare it with anything else. It's I guess it's one extreme to refer to it as colonialism, which I don't do. I don't refer to it as colonialism. Well, the difference is, Noam, that the people who settled Australia didn't have a historical connection with them. Now, that doesn't make Australia any less legitimate. The people who arrived here on January 26, 1788, were Europeans, but they conquered the land by the rules of engagement as they were in those times. But the people who started settling into Ottoman-ruled Palestine from 1882 onwards did have a historic connection. So it is a more unique scenario, yes?
Well, let's take a close look. There were Jews in Palestine at the time of the European immigration. They were violently anti-Zionist. Their survivors still are. They live in a sector of Jerusalem. They regard Zionism as an abomination. They've in fact, at one point, pleaded with Jordan to take over Jerusalem so they could have freedom of religion again. Those were the original Jewish settlers at the time when the European Jews began to immigrate into Palestine. You take a look at the time of the Balfour Declaration, about 10% of the population was Jewish, most of them anti-Zionist. So yes, they claimed a historical connection from 2,000 years ago. From the Western point of view, yes, that's what counts, because they are, that's the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's our tradition, so that counts. What other people like doesn't mean anything. Churchill expressed it very nicely at the time of the, when the British were still in control of Palestine and there were some discussions of partition. He said it very straight. He said, look, I don't think that the dog has a right to the manger in which he lives. If a higher culture and a higher order of people come and take the manger, they have a right to it. That's European civilization, okay? And on that basis, yes, it's justified.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
So
well, I guess
that's the way it is.
Sure, sure. Okay, and so while we're still on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Professor, what do you see as the way forwards? How do we fix it now?
One way forward would be to accept the position of the entire world, most recently stated by the UN Security Council in Resolution 2334. As I say, US and Israel don't accept it, but the rest of the world do. So let's take that as a basis. That's essentially the 1976 resolution that Israel rejected, the Arab states accepted, and that the United States vetoed. So we start as a basis with the internationally recognized borders. We can take what used to be the official US position up until the mid-70s. It's the basis for a settlement with, the words were minor and mutual adjustments. It was a ceasefire line, so we'll straighten it out. And on that basis, we'll set up two states, Israel in its legal territory, Palestine in what's left of the former Palestine to the indigenous inhabitants. And let's try to establish there'll be some shifts of the border, some exchanges of territory, minor ones, to settle it, and that could be the basis of some kind of arrangement. In my view, not a very good arrangement.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody who knows that area knows, I'm sure Ghil'ad would agree, drawing a line through Cisjordan, the area from Jordan to the sea, drawing a line through it is highly artificial.
Sure.
And my guess is that as soon as the cycle of violence reduces, the Israeli oppression, which is brutal and violent, as soon as that's removed, what you'll start to see is some sort of interactions across the border, commercial, cultural, others. In fact, it happens every time there's a relaxation. Could move towards some kind of federal arrangement, which I think myself would be much better for everyone involved.
Look,
and go on from there.
Sure.
There's no reason to worship the imperial imposed borders. Okay, right. The border between Israel and Lebanon was imposed by imperial force. The British and the French wanted to rule the place, so they drew some lines.
Yeah.
It's a completely artificial border. I could tell you an anecdote. When I lived in Israel for a while in a kibbutz back in the early 50s, and I was hiking up in the north, and while I was hiking, a guy came behind me in a Jeep on a dirt road and started yelling at me. He said, in Hebrew, he said, "Come back, you're in the wrong country." I had wandered into Lebanon. There was no border there, and there shouldn't be a border. So I think that border could erode, and you could have a move towards a much more sensible society. But it has to be in steps. And the first step should be the overwhelming, virtually universal international consensus, which I just described. So there's a way to go about it. Israel and the United States have to agree. Australia too, I should say, because Australia has tended to try to block political settlement following U.S. policy.
Well, no, the only comment I guess that comes to mind is that if we're going to take the view that some of these borders are colonial creations. I mean, you look at a country like Pakistan, for example, the border to its west is called the Durand Line because it was drawn by a guy called Mortimer Durand in 1892, 1893 or thereabouts. And the border to its east is called the Radcliffe Line because it was drawn by a bloke called Cyril Radcliffe. But that, I guess, that doesn't invalidate the existence of Pakistan as the Muslim majority half of what was once British India. The way I look at Israel is, okay, it's a re-indigenized country where it's the people who connect with its ancient civilization that once existed on that land have been able to come back and reconstitute their demography and their sovereignty. And if we can accept countries like the one I live in, or like the one you live in, both of which were settled by people who came from someplace else, without a historical connection, why can't we then accept Israel as a country which was settled by people who did have a historical connection?
Well, in fact, the entire world agrees with you except for two states. One of them is Israel, which rejects everything you've just said. They do not want to go to the internationally recognized border. The other is the United States, which backs them in that refusal. And Australia also does most of the time. So what you're saying is what the entire world is saying, except for Israel, which flatly rejects it, and the United States, which vetoes it, okay?
Right. Okay, let's invite our friend, Professor Zuckermann. I know your field is linguistics, but you might have an opinion or two to share on this. What are your thoughts on what we've just been debating?
Well, I left Israel in order to distance myself from that discussion, and you to get in. Look, I am humbled by two political experts, and as it happens, both of you are also experts of language. I would like, if you want me to ask a couple of questions that are related more to politics and to humanity than to linguistics, I would like to ask a couple of questions, Noam. I mean, Sherry, you can
go ahead.
Join. I mean, in 2011, Steven Pinker published a book entitled The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he argued, by and large, that violence in the world has declined. Do you agree with him, Noam?
Well, there has been considerable scholarly inquiry into what he claimed. About 95% of human history is hunter-gatherer societies. And the main scholarship on that, Brian Ferguson, Stephen Corey, others, says he's flatly wrong about 95% of human history. Until you get to the state system, there was nothing like the organized violence since. If you come to the more recent period, he's correct about the period from 1945 to the present. Now, there have been, but if you look back before 1945, Europe was the most savage, violent, cruel part of the entire world. Europeans got their highest joy out of massacring one another. In the 17th century, the religious wars, about a third of Germany was wiped out. Why did it stop in 1945? Because Europeans recognized the next time they play their favorite game of slaughtering each other, everything will be finished. Okay? So they moved towards a peaceful period. Nothing to do with better angels of our nature. Pinker likes to think his following book was about the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment brought this period of peace. Really? The Enlightenment brought hideous violence in Europe and the conquest of the world. In the Western Hemisphere alone, Europeans, at the time of the Enlightenment, wiped out about 80 million people or so. Nice, better angels of our nature. So it's always nice to look at the facts, not just nice ideas.
Now, I would like to ask you about political correctness. My friend Stephen Fry once said, it's now very common to hear people say, I'm rather offended by that, as if that gives them certain rights. It's actually nothing more than a whine, says Stephen Fry. I find that offensive. It has no meaning. It has no purpose. It has no reason to be respected as a phrase. I'm offended by that. Well, so fucking what? This is Stephen Fry from 5th of June, 2005. I'm asking you, has political correctness gone mad? Or do you regard political correctness, which is kind of a linguistic phenomenon, as a positive development in human existence, especially given what you said about the wrong assertion by Steven Pinker?
Well, let's take you and me. I suppose somebody put up a big advertisement, a big bulletin board in Times Square, New York, saying, send the kikes to crematoria. I wouldn't like it. Would you like it?
Well, but you know, Mel Gibson told Winona Ryder apparently, so you're an oven dodger. Now, my point is that...
You're not answering my question. Would you like it?
To be honest, I prefer to have that being said, kike or oven dodger, than that not being said.
So we should have big billboards in Times Square, New York, saying kikes to the crematoria. Should we also have a statue of Hitler in the Berlin main square in Berlin? Well, political correctness says, no, you shouldn't do that. And I agree with that, and I think you agree. Okay, this whole story began when some other ox started getting gored. Okay, as long as it was just things directed against the left, everything was fine. Now it's extending to some of the privileged people, so I have to get upset about it. Does it go too far? Sometimes, yes, but there's something very serious behind it. Take say, Afro-Americans. They have suffered 400 years of vicious, hideous repression, unremitting, leaving a grim legacy. They don't like it when somebody calls them nigger or says, boy, come over here. Just like you and I don't like it if someone says, kikes go to crematoria. Now we call that political correctness because it's going after some of those lowly people, not against us. It could go too far, but there's something very serious about it. Same with women's rights, same with rights of other minorities. So yes, sometimes goes too far, but there's something fundamentally correct about it.
So Noam, I mean, I would like to just to figure out that I understood. You believe that political correctness actually manages to change and to make people, for example, less racist. So if Mel Gibson is not allowed to say oven dodger to Winona Ryder, he might be less anti-Semitic eventually because he knows that this is a no-no.
I think it's part of overcoming anti-Semitism. Part of overcoming anti-Semitism is to try to prevent people from glorifying the protocols of the elders of Zion, from trying to prevent them from saying, Jews own the world, just take a look at the Rothschilds. Jews are the worst criminals, just take a look at Murder Incorporated and Bugsy Siegel. I think don't call them kikes, don't tell jokes about the Jews, don't call them Shylocks. I think all of that is part of overcoming anti-Semitism. Doesn't cure it. The cure has to go much deeper, but it's part of the steps towards it. And it's moving towards a more civilized world where you have some sensitivity towards the feelings of other human beings, not just Jews. So you go back 50 years, it was considered perfectly proper to make jokes about the WAPs. Okay, headline in the main business journal in the United States, Forbes journal, in 1932, praising Mussolini. The headline front story was, "The WAPs are unwapping themselves." The Italians are finally getting it together. You wouldn't say that now, because we have some degree of sensitivity. And as that moves, people who were racists, who wanted to be, to say things like that, felt that's their right, they're superior, they don't like it, okay? And that's happening right in front of us. Can it go too far? Yeah, sometimes it does. So let's control it when it does.
When your father wrote Hebrew, the eternal language, he did not mean eternal language as a mother tongue of the Jews, but rather as a cultural language.
As a cultural heritage, which was never lost in one form or another. But of course, throughout most of Jewish history, people didn't speak Hebrew. Even, I don't have to tell you, but the later books of the Bible aren't even in Hebrew. Aramaic.
So just before passing to Sherry, so you think that your father would have agreed with the idea that the new language of Israel, which I call Israeli, but some people call modern Hebrew, it was, if I use an ornithological metaphor, it was on the one hand a phoenix, that's Hebrew, rising from the ashes. On the other hand, it was a cuckoo, so it lays its eggs in another bird, tricking it to believe that it is its own offspring. This is Yiddish, so there is a lot of Yiddish within the Israeli language, and then it's like a magpie stealing from American, from Arabic, so he would have agreed that it was a hybrid. It was not kind of, as opposed to Haramati, who argued that Hebrew never died and it was a mother tongue. Your father would have said, no, actually it is a new kind of vernacularization and therefore it's a new language.
No, but you could say that about any language. Take, say, English. About more than half the vocabulary has Romance origins. So it's a hybrid, like every language is.
So look, and Noam, if I mentioned an ornithological metaphor, I don't know if you follow this kind of eagle versus owl. So like, correct me if I'm wrong. Chomsky linguists are eagles. They're waiting, they look at the language from high above and they're looking for some specific characteristic that they might want to get. And this is whereas people like me are more like owls. Owls they are very close to the ground. They work with communities, they work with societies. They are ordinary working linguists, so to speak. OWL as in the acronym. Is it true that you once called, not a revivalist, but a documentary linguist, a stamp collector?
As stamp collector? Well, I think a lot of it's like a lot of biology, is kind of studying particular organisms and their detailed character. And then there's, say, molecular biology, which is trying to find the fundamental properties of organisms generally. Uh, so that's, you could say the same of any science.
So, so you're happy that there are eagles and owls at the same time. It's not that everybody should be eagle or.
In fact, the detailed work that is done is based on a minute study of individual particular languages. That's been true since the beginning. So in 1957, when the book that you mentioned, Syntactic Structure, was published, it was a theoretical book, but one of my colleagues was just working on a grammar of Hidatsa, an American Indian language, studying details of that language. There are some individuals who actually work at both levels, like Ken Hale, who you knew very well, was one of the founders of Australian linguistics, but was also a great theoretical linguist.
So, do you believe in Popperian falsificationism as a cornerstone of science? Do you think that falsifiability is important?
In a very abstract sense, but if you look at the actual sciences, if you have a fairly substantial theory and some evidence comes along that seems to contradict it, you almost never give up the theory. What you do is put it aside and see if maybe someday or other it will be explained. This goes way back to the beginnings of science. Popper, of course, knew this. He was giving a kind of an abstract ideal conception of what would make a theory a legitimate theory if it could be falsified. But he knew perfectly well that scientists don't work that way. If they worked that way, there would never be any science, because there's always tons of apparently deviant material that you can't account for. So if you look at, it's true ever since the beginning. So Galileo, for example, his experiments were never actually carried out. Most of them were thought experiments. If he had actually tried them, they wouldn't have worked. So you look at his explanation of why the rate of fall is independent of mass. It was a thought experiment. If he had actually dropped balls from the top of the Tower of Pisa, you get all sorts of strange results. It wouldn't have come out. The wind is blowing, you drop them the wrong way, and whatever. In fact, finding a good experiment is a highly theoretical endeavor. Experiments are theory directed. You don't just do anything that comes to mind. You try to refine the experiment so that it gives the results that are relevant to the theory. Every theory that's ever been proposed is surrounded by masses of apparently falsifying evidence, which after special relativity was, Einstein proposed special relativity in 1905, there was a raft of experiments carried out by very good experimenters to try to test it, and most of them falsified it. But serious scientists didn't pay any attention. The theory was just too good to be wrong. So we'll wait and see what was wrong with the experiments. That happens constantly.
So universal grammar, do you consider it falsifiable, or, empirically falsifiable, or in other words, it doesn't really matter if it's not for the time being?
The term universal grammar is misunderstood. It has a traditional use in which it means principles that are supposed to hold of all or most languages. But universal grammar in the modern sense has a very different meaning. It's the theory of the genetic component of the faculty of language. So humans all have an innate capacity, which in fact is species specific. There's no analog elsewhere in the organic world. And apparently it's shared by humans independently of where they are. And that capacity has a basis in our biological nature. It's genetically based. And the theory of that genetic basis is universal grammar. So that's not only falsifiable, but it's falsified all the time. Every time you make new discoveries, that's the nature of science. If you're still teaching what you were teaching 20 years ago, this field is dead or you're dead, you know. But if there's discoveries coming along, sure, the theories will change. I mean, take, say, fundamental physics. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was an experiment carried out under a mountain in Italy, which found some anomalies in the standard theory, which, if verified by further experiments, will require a possibly serious modification of fundamental physics. Physicists are all excited about it. They hope that it will falsify it, because then there'll be new exciting developments to look into. That's normal science.
And therefore, am I right that you do not have any linguistic regrets? For example, you do not feel that there is something you should have never said linguistically, or a book that you would have never published? Am I right, or is it not true?
Well, if every article I write and every book I write revises and changes things I'd said before, it's an evolving field. Keep learning things, get deeper results. Turns out that, so for example, for years, in fact, most of the basic rules, I don't want to go into technical details, you know it, but the basic rules were essentially phrase structure rules for composition and transformational rules to create new structures. And it always to account for the strange phenomenon of displacement in language. The ubiquitous phenomenon in language is very curious. You don't pronounce things where you interpret them. So if you say, what book did you read? You interpret what book as the object of read, just as if you had said, I read what book. That's the way you interpret it, but the way you say it, the what book is somewhere else. So that phenomenon of displacement was always considered a strange curiosity. Why should language have this? It's some strange imperfection of language. And I believed that most of my life until recently, when it was discovered that that's the core principle of language. It's the other one that's the anomaly. So it's the opposite of what we thought. The simplest possible grammar, the one that nature would have invented, just uses displacement. That's its basic element. That's the simplest operation. So you have a significant revision of what you believed before, but that happens all the time. In fact, take something even simpler, the order of words in a sentence. So say in English, you would say, read the book. In Japanese, you would say, book, read, different orders. In the entire roughly 2,500 years of the study of language, what's been studied is things like the order of words, the sounds of words, and so on. Well, and now it turns out that that's probably not really language. It's a periphery of language. It's the core language is an internal system of which you don't see, which is producing basically thoughts. And then it can get externalized into one or another sensory motor system. But that's kind of like taking a program in your laptop and attaching it to one or another printer. The printer isn't part of the program, and the sensory motor output isn't part of the language. It's something. So things like order of words don't even exist in the internal language. And it's very striking that young infants know this without any experience. So a 3-year-old infant knows right away that you pay no attention to the order of words, which is 100% of what you hear, and you only pay attention to the structure of the sentence, which you never hear. That's pretty well established by now. So there are always new discoveries coming along. I'm really sorry, but
Yep.
way overdue for another appointment.
Not a problem. Look, we'll wrap this up. We want to thank you very much for your time, Professor Noam Chomsky and Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. We've talked about linguistics, we've talked about politics and world history, and I hope that this is not the last time that we do this together. Be well, and let's keep in touch. And thank you very much to our very well-behaved audience. Thank you for your input. And if some of your questions were not answered, by all means, send them through to contact@sherrysufi.com, and I will put them through to Professor Chomsky and Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our Facebook. Thank you very much, attendees. Thanks, Ghil'ad. Thanks, Noam.
Thank you, Noam.